Hi everyone, this is Miss Saunders here, and today the first thing that we're going to be talking about a few different things in this PowerPoint, but the first thing we're going to be talking about is how to write a hook for an academic essay. Really, this is a skill that you can kind of use for text outside of, academia as well, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So what is a hook? A hook is the first sentence or a series of sentences that start a text. It's called a hook because it's supposed to hook the reader into what they're reading. So basically, it's one kind of simple way to draw the reader into what you're talking about to create intrigue into the text. So draw the reader in, create intrigue, demonstrate some level of craft in the writing choices. Now, this might be especially useful, a technique, if I think of this to transport it outside of academia. Say you are cold emailing, so you're emailing someone who you've never met and you've never really had any connection with in life, but say you wanted to land an internship. You might think about kind of using a hook as a way to pique or spark their interest in your email, because otherwise it's kind of like, well, I guess there's no established relationships, so no reason for them to be interested in what you're saying unless you kind of make them so. So next question is, how do you create intrigue into a text? How do you demonstrate some level of craft? How do you draw the reader in? So how should a hook be phrased? A good hook should create some type of interest in the text, should find a way to introduce the reader to what they will be reading about in the text. So it's kind of like, I guess, being clever, thinking about where the audience is at and how can you kind of draw them into your topic in a way that which you can draw them in with the clever hook and then seek or transition to the rest of your introduction, right? There shouldn't be like a gap between the hook. It should kind of lead naturally in. So forms of a hook, we have a question, opinionated statement, personal story or anecdote, fact/statistic, metaphor/simile, description, or quotation. So we're going to look at a few of these examples. I definitely suggest in your essays this semester trying some of these out. You could even pause this lecture and do an example for each of these for maybe your essay 1 or your essay 2. That would just give you practice of experimenting with the different styles and kind of finding the one that works for you best, although you don't want to use the same one every time, right? Ideally, you want to have, a variety in different papers that you turn in. You want to show that you are kind of using different types of hooks, as well as different types of writing styles, etc. So here's an example from a hook from a student paper, and this was a research paper about CTE. Which is basically what happens to football players when they hit their heads too many times during the course of the games or in practices, and it's meant to cause, it causes damage to the brain, which ultimately causes a number of changes to a human's personality. That's what a lot of scientists argue. I think Aaron Hernandez kind of made the condition more popular because apparently during his autopsy they found a lot of CTE, like a really unusual level, and that was said to be linked to some of the kind of crimes that he did. Anyway, so this was a research paper about CTE, and we see it starts, this is the first sentence, and this is a beginning of an anecdote. The student was an amazing writer. My parents finally allowing me to play football in middle school was a decision that they would soon regret. And then he goes into an anecdote of him, how he got into a concussion when he was younger and how, they never let him play football again. And that kind of led into the introduction about CTE and the dangers of playing that sport. So that was, if we go back, that was a personal story or anecdote. And that's a way to spark the reader's interest and draw them into the text. So here's an example from my own writing, and I think this one is kind of goes under the category of bold, opinionated statement. And this was from a letter that I was writing to try to get an agent for my cross-gendered manuscript. I actually now have one. This was I wrote a long time ago. So my name is Vanessa, and I love writing about climate change. So here we have a kind of, I guess it's kind of a flat-footed statement, but it expresses a opinion, right? It's an opinion statement. I love writing about climate change. For the reader, when you're writing, you always have to think about what the reader is experiencing on the other end of, as I like to say, the writing tunnel, because you put something in, and on the other end, they're totally separated from what you were thinking about when you're writing it, but so they experience it in a different way. So this, I think, I'd like to think creates intrigue in the reader's mind, like, why is she writing about climate change? Why does she love writing about climate change? And, it's also kind of, I guess, crafted as towards my intended audience, because I know that the publishing industry is interested in publishing texts about climate change in this like current, literary climate. So we see a few things going on there. So here's another hook example. This one I wrote just specifically for this exercise, and this is just the example of the question. So why would you drive a car when you could drive a plane? So, and this would be, this would be about a paper, for instance, about like becoming a pilot, right? Maybe like whether or not it's a paper about whether or not being a pilot is an exciting career choice. It doesn't really matter. The point is, it's a question. If you start off an essay like this, it kind of draws us in, because first of all, driving a plane is kind of, so there's that kind of weird repetition. So it sparks interest in the reader's mind, right? So that's basically how the hook should work. Question, opinionated statement, personal story or anecdote, fact, statistic, metaphor, simile, description of something, or quotation from someone else. So what can we learn about writing in general from thinking about hooks? And I think we can learn the importance of a strong sentence. So every good essay consists of a number of good sentences. If you pay as much attention to every single sentence as you do to your hook, your writing will probably be excellent. So I think a hook is just a nice example for us to focus on language on the level of the sentence. And, we're focusing on making a first sentence that's really well crafted towards its purpose. And really, every single sentence of our paper has a purpose, right? It needs to be crafted towards that purpose. I think another thing is that you just want to try to avoid, grammatical errors, infelicities of word choice, punctuation errors too, because if you think about the reader on the other end of the tunnel, when they see a mistake like that, it kind of erodes your credibility as an author, right? It immediately makes them ask questions. When I would turn in creative texts with typos in my MFA program, people would always have questions like, oh, was this a mistake or was this intentional? So, and it would be so frustrating for me because I couldn't say anything during the workshop, but it just goes to show the importance of writing is really as much of a skill as making a bridge or crafting a house, I guess. And you need to make sure that every piece of the puzzle is shaped for its purpose and put in well, so the whole thing is secure. So that's really what I think, what's important to think about writing in general. In addition to, you also want to generally get up to the point in the beginning of your text and make your reader, interest your reader in what you're saying and make them stay interested. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about writing towards your audience, which a lot of this kind of dovetails off of what we were thinking about when we were thinking about the rhetorical situation, because we were thinking a lot about, appeals towards your intended audience. We've also talked a lot about ethos, which is establishing credibility. So we're definitely using these ideas as we think about writing towards your audience. So things you want to consider when you are writing towards your audience. You want to consider specificity. Generally, you want to try to avoid being vague. You want to instead be concrete. So that's the next point, being concrete in your word choices. Appropriate levels of formality. So generally, all the texts that you'll write for this class, unless it says otherwise, are written towards an academic audience. Academic writing is traditionally pretty formal, as probably will be a lot of like professional texts that you create later in life in your jobs, although I think in professional writing, you also want to think about like courtesy, and there's a kind of a different relationship. But academic writing is pretty formal. So you'll definitely want to be thinking about tone, which is our next point. Vocabulary. You want to thinking about curating, so making content according to the needs of your audience. And then you want to think about organizing content according to the needs of your audience. So here we have a personal, here we have a personal example, and this is the same sample as the one that I showed you guys earlier. And this one is, my name is Vanessa, and for the past 3 years, I have been writing about climate change. An acquaintance of Mariama Lockington, I thought I might be a good fit for your list based on your interest in cross-genre literature. My manuscript, The Flat Woman, is a novel in verse that runs over just under 14,500 words. Excerpts have been published or are forthcoming from Pank, Entropy, Nat, Brut, Poor Claudia's, Stockholm Little Review, and other magazines. So this is me, again, writing to a literary agent for my cross-genre manuscript, which is kind of like a unique type of book. So not every agent is going to be interested in this type of book. But if we go back, we want to think about tone, vocabulary, appropriate levels of formality, being concrete in your word choices, and then curating and organizing content according to the needs of your audience. So here we have, you can see that this letter is written specifically for a specific person because I mentioned that they're acquaintance of someone else that I know. I also say things that I particularly think that this agent will be interested in. So excerpts have been published or forthcoming from these established literary magazines. So there you see I'm curating content according to the needs of my audience. In terms of organizing content in the needs of my audience, you can see I'm using a hook. It's a little bit different than the one we saw before, but it is kind of drawing their interest, right? And it's kind of attracting interest and intrigue into the text. Then I also want to think about maintaining interest. So I mentioned about how we have like a mutual acquaintance. I'm making it obvious that I'm thinking about my intended audience as I'm writing, by saying that I might be a good fit for your list based on your interest in cross-genre literature. Next, I kind of go into a little bit about the project. So my manuscript is a novel in verse that runs over 14,500 words. We see in the example, when I say 14,500 words, that's an example of me being specific, right, and also concrete. If I had said it's just under, it is pretty long, right? That would be more vague, right? And vague writing is usually, if you want to go towards writing that's clear, you want to kind of evade being vague as much as you can. So we've got specificity being concrete. Now let's look at the tone, levels of formality, and vocabulary. So I'd say the tone here is like, you see I'm not using, so this is a professional text, which in a lot of ways is kind of similar, especially because it's someone I've never met, it's similar in the levels of formality that I'm using with my the other person at the end of the line. So we can see that I'm not using any slang. I'm not using more like colloquial or conversational words. Actually, as I'm looking at acquaintance is kind of a more formal word, right? But a lot of these words I'm using, and I think this is a good thing to point out, are actually quite short, concrete words. So concrete would be something like literal and tangible. Abstract would be something more like in the air, right? Something that doesn't like physically exist. It's harder for the reader to get a picture of in its mind. So in terms of like creating writing that's strong, you see I'm actually using typically pretty short words that are concrete that just pop in the reader's mind. And we see I'm being pretty formal. Some of my language is formal. My tone is formal when I'm saying like excerpts have been published or forthcoming from. That's a kind of like formal thing you see in a lot of writers' bios, kind of formal language tick, I guess. But I'm not speaking to this person as if they are my friend or as if they are my mom or someone that I knew. And so these are all, things, even if I had included a single word like wow, that would make a huge difference, right, in terms of the intended audience of this piece. So really, every single word I have in here is important, and it's creating ultimately to my ethos, right, my credibility by not having any mistakes, and also being, you know, as appropriate for my intended audience as well. So here we'll go talk a little bit more about tonal differences. So the example, the difference between sir versus dude versus man. So in general, you'll want to avoid using slang in an academic paper. So depending on, it's probably, you don't need to like address your professors, a male professor as sir or anything. It's not that excessively formal, but you definitely want to avoid using a word like dude, because that's really a more colloquial or conversational word, and not really the word that's well suited for academic writing. When writing a text in general, and this is not just for text in this class, you'll want to consider the levels of formality and propriety that are appropriate for that audience. So we can see the difference of using sir versus dude versus man. There's very different tonals or levels of propriety that are associated with each one. And you'll just want to make sure that you're using words that are appropriate for your audience. So here we have, and I know this is from, you know, an earlier week, this text we read an earlier week, but I wanted to kind of return back to it because I think it's a good example of a letter that's written towards its audience, or a text that's written towards its audience very well. So this is an excerpt from Letting from Birmingham jail, which, if we can recall, was written to a number of white clergymen who had released a statement kind of criticizing Martin Luther King's actions, and he's writing, as the title suggests, writing the letter from Birmingham jail. So, while confined here in Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling our present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom, if ever, do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all of the criticisms that crossed my desk, my secretaries would be engaged in little else in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I would like to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. So we see here that Martin Luther King this is a public statement that he's writing, and it's addressed specifically to men who, I mean, you could argue there are a few different points to the essay itself, and there's definitely a lot of really interesting complexity. But he's basically, I think, one of his main theses is that you are supposed to be men who cultivate high morals, and yet you criticize my desire for a better world for me based on the color of my skin, or to escape the kind of injustices that are directed towards me based on the color of my skin. So it's a formal text, right? And we see that he is keeping with the formality, especially noticed in the last sentence, but since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I would like to answer your statement when I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. So he's showing a certain amount, a lot of, you know, goodwill in this statement. Well, he actually says that they're men of genuine goodwill. He's not using a lot of like informal slang to address them. He doesn't call them names. He's using diction or word choices that we associate with like formal speech. But it's interesting as well because I think tonally, there's a little sense of him, a little bit of sarcasm, I guess. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that crossed my desk, my secretaries would be engaged in little else in the course of my day, and I would have no time for constructive work. So it's really interesting to me that in this text, although he really manages to keep it very like formal and quite austere and definitely appropriate for its like purpose and intended audience, we see that he's able to imbue the language with, you know, different valences, you know, associated more with sarcasm or kind of pushing back. Because, you know, as we can see from his letter, the frustration that he feels, it's very much justified. So to employ the sarcasm in this sense is to kind of remind the readers of that sense of his. And he does a really good job of pointing out exactly why he would feel that frustration and feel that, you know. So I think that this is a really good example of how I guess you can have a lot of tonal variety under a single umbrella in language, and a lot of it is the difference of a single word or two. There's a lot of exciting things to pick up on this text in general. All right, so what can we learn from writing towards your audience? In a text, every single word is significant. It's true, in an essay as well. And if sometimes a mistake that you might make, and I see this, relatively often, is just a matter of a single word that just isn't appropriate for an academic audience. And I think we do so much writing on the internet and on social media that we're used to kind of writing text for that forum that sometimes we kind of slip up. But it's not a big deal. It's just something to catch in revision. But when you are writing, it is important to think about, just to wrap up, specificity, being concrete in your word choices, appropriate levels of formality, tone, vocabulary, and curating content according to the needs of your audience, and organizing content according to the needs of your audience. All right, everyone, I hope this has been helpful, and I hope these are some tips and strategies that you can use and think about when you're creating text in this class and outside of this class.